The corridor of the maternity ward smelled of antiseptic and anxiety, a place where joy and fear lived side by side. New mothers whispered lullabies through exhaustion, nurses moved briskly with practiced calm, and somewhere behind a closed door a newborn cried, announcing a new beginning. It was here, of all places, that the tension between a mother-in-law and her daughter-in-law reached its cruel peak. The older woman stood rigidly near the entrance, her jaw set, eyes cold with judgment. Her words came sharp and unfiltered, accusing the younger woman of weakness, of failure, of not being worthy of the family name. She insisted that the daughter-in-law leave, claiming she had no right to stay, no right to hold the child she had just given birth to. The cruelty of the moment stunned those nearby, yet the mother-in-law seemed fueled by her own certainty, convinced that control was hers by birthright. The daughter-in-law, pale and shaking, clutched the edge of the bed as if it were the last solid thing in a world suddenly tilting. She had imagined this day as a quiet triumph after months of struggle, pain, and anticipation. Instead, she found herself being told she was unwanted, disposable, an inconvenience even in the moment she became a mother. Her eyes filled with tears, not only from the sting of the words but from the shock that they were being spoken here, in a place meant for healing. Nurses exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to intervene or wait for the storm to pass. The young woman's voice barely rose above a whisper as she tried to defend herself, but every sentence was cut down, dismissed, turned into another reason for her removal. Then, without warning, the rhythm of the corridor changed. Footsteps approached with a confidence that drew attention before the person even appeared. Conversations faltered. The mother-in-law turned, ready to assert herself against whoever dared interrupt, but the sight before her drained the color from her face. The sudden guest was someone she did not expect, someone whose presence shifted the balance of power instantly. Words failed her. The authority she had wielded moments before evaporated into stunned silence. In that instant, the room seemed to hold its breath. The guest spoke calmly, each word deliberate, cutting through the tension like a blade through fog. There was no shouting, no theatrical display, just a firm declaration that cruelty would not be tolerated. The mother-in-law's accusations were dismantled one by one, exposed as selfish attempts to control rather than protect. The daughter-in-law listened in disbelief as someone finally stood between her and the storm, naming the injustice she had endured. For the first time since the confrontation began, she felt seen. The mother-in-law tried to respond, but her voice faltered, her confidence shattered. She had not expected resistance, let alone such decisive opposition. The command was clear. This was not her stage, not her moment to dominate. The maternity ward belonged to the mother and child, and anyone who threatened that peace would be shown the door. As the tension subsided, the daughter-in-law exhaled a breath she felt she had been holding for months. The nurses returned to their routines, the corridor regained its rhythm, and the newborn's cries softened into gentle murmurs. What remained was a quiet understanding that power, when abused, could be reclaimed, and that even the most intimidating voices could be silenced by truth. The mother-in-law left without another word, her authority undone not by force but by exposure. Elsewhere, under bright studio lights and the hum of cameras, another confrontation unfolded, different in setting but eerily similar in spirit. The talk show set of The View had long been a place of spirited debate, but on this day, the tension crackled with an intensity that could not be ignored. Patti Labelle, a legend whose voice had carried generations through love and heartbreak, sat poised but visibly irritated. Joy Behar leaned forward, ready with a pointed remark that struck closer to the bone than intended. What began as a discussion quickly veered into something sharper, more personal, as words overlapped and tempers flared. Patti's patience, honed by decades in an industry that often demanded silence over honesty, reached its limit. She straightened in her chair, eyes blazing not with anger alone, but with a refusal to be diminished. Her response came swift and unapologetic. She reminded everyone present that respect was not optional, that her experience and voice were not props for entertainment. Each sentence carried the weight of a lifetime spent fighting to be heard in rooms that underestimated her. The studio audience fell silent, sensing that this was no rehearsed exchange, but a genuine eruption born of accumulated frustration. Joy attempted to interject, but Patti pressed on, not raising her voice, yet commanding the space with an authority that could not be challenged. She spoke of boundaries, of the importance of listening rather than provoking, of the difference between debate and dismissal. The cameras captured every expression, every shift in posture, broadcasting the moment to millions who would later argue about who was right and who went too far. But in the heat of that exchange, Patti was not performing for an audience, she was reclaiming her narrative, refusing to be boxed into silence or politeness for the sake of comfort. The clash ended as abruptly as it began, leaving behind a charged stillness. The hosts moved on, but the energy lingered, a reminder that even in polished studios, raw truth could break through. Viewers at home recognized something familiar in Patti's stance, the moment when enough is enough, when dignity demands a response. It echoed the scene in the maternity ward, where silence had nearly swallowed a vulnerable voice until someone intervened. Both moments, though worlds apart, shared a common thread. They revealed how power dynamics operate, how easily authority can slip into cruelty, and how transformative it is when that dynamic is challenged. In the hospital, it was a sudden guest who shifted the balance, turning humiliation into protection. On television, it was Patti Labelle herself, standing firm against a dismissive tone, asserting that her voice mattered. In both cases, the message was unmistakable: control rooted in disrespect cannot endure when confronted with truth and courage. By the end of the day, the daughter-in-law cradled her child with a renewed sense of strength, knowing she was not as alone as she had feared. And across living rooms and social feeds, Patti's words continued to resonate, sparking conversations about respect, boundaries, and the cost of staying silent. These stories, though dramatic, reflected everyday struggles played out in quieter ways all around us. They reminded us that whether in a hospital corridor or under studio lights, there are moments when speaking up changes everything, when the right voice at the right time can leave oppression speechless and restore a measure of justice where it was nearly lost. The maternity ward was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place where pain gave way to relief and fear slowly transformed into hope. Soft lights glowed above polished floors, and the steady beeping of monitors created a rhythm that spoke of life continuing, fragile yet resilient. In this space, a young woman lay exhausted after childbirth, her body aching, her heart overwhelmed by the reality of becoming a mother. She had imagined holding her child surrounded by support, perhaps even reconciliation. Instead, she faced a confrontation that cut deeper than any physical pain she had endured that day. Her mother-in-law stood at the foot of the bed like a judge delivering a sentence already decided. Her words were sharp, each one dripping with resentment that had been building long before this moment. She accused the young woman of shame, of dishonoring the family, of trapping her son into a life he did not deserve. With a cold certainty, she demanded that the daughter-in-law leave the hospital, claiming that her presence was an embarrassment and that the child would be better off without her influence. The cruelty of the demand echoed against the sterile walls, shocking nurses and visitors alike. It was not just an argument, it was an attempt to erase a woman at the very moment she had brought new life into the world. The daughter-in-law tried to speak, her voice trembling from exhaustion and disbelief. She reminded her mother-in-law of the months she had carried the child, the nights spent alone while her husband worked far away, the fear she had pushed through to bring this baby safely into her arms. But every word was dismissed, twisted into proof of her supposed inadequacy. Tears streamed down her face, not only from humiliation but from the crushing realization that love and effort were not enough to earn acceptance in this family. Around them, the ward felt smaller, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Just as the situation threatened to break her completely, a presence appeared at the doorway, unexpected and commanding. The sudden guest stepped into the room with a calm confidence that instantly shifted the atmosphere. There was no hesitation in their movements, no uncertainty in their gaze. The mother-in-law froze, her expression changing from righteous fury to stunned disbelief. She recognized that the power she had been wielding so freely was no longer hers alone. For the first time since she entered the room, she was forced to listen. The guest spoke firmly, calling out the cruelty for what it was. They reminded the mother-in-law that this hospital room was not a courtroom, and she was not the authority she believed herself to be. The daughter-in-law was a patient, a mother, and a human being deserving of dignity. Each sentence landed with quiet force, dismantling the accusations and exposing the real motive behind them: control masked as concern. The mother-in-law attempted to interrupt, but her voice faltered, the confidence drained from it. Surrounded by witnesses and faced with undeniable truth, she had no defense left. As the confrontation ended, the silence that followed felt different, no longer heavy with fear but filled with a fragile sense of justice. The mother-in-law left the room without another word, her retreat as abrupt as her attack had been. The daughter-in-law collapsed into sobs, this time not from despair but from relief. Nurses moved in gently, offering tissues and quiet words of reassurance. The baby stirred softly, unaware of the storm that had passed, and in that small movement, the mother found strength she did not know she had. She realized that being abandoned by those who refused to see her worth did not define her future. Far from the hushed corridors of the hospital, another scene of tension played out in front of a national audience. On the brightly lit set of The View, the energy was electric, charged with the promise of debate and the risk of conflict. Patti Labelle sat among the hosts, her presence commanding respect earned through decades of artistry and resilience. The conversation began casually, but beneath the surface, sharp edges waited to emerge. Joy Behar posed a question that carried an undertone of dismissal, and in that moment, the atmosphere shifted. Patti's expression hardened slightly, a lifetime of experience flashing in her eyes. She had navigated rooms where her voice was ignored, her achievements minimized, her boundaries tested. This was not new territory, but it was no longer one she was willing to cross quietly. As Joy pressed her point, Patti responded, her words measured but unmistakably firm. She challenged the tone of the question, asserting that respect was not optional and that her perspective was not up for casual dismissal. The exchange grew more intense, voices overlapping as the tension rose. Patti did not shout, but her presence filled the space, her authority undeniable. She spoke about the importance of honoring lived experience, about how easy it was to provoke without listening, and about the exhaustion that came from constantly having to defend one's worth. The studio fell quiet, the audience sensing the gravity of the moment. This was not entertainment, it was a boundary being drawn in real time. Joy attempted to steer the conversation back, but the point had already been made. Patti had reclaimed control of the narrative, refusing to be reduced to a soundbite or a foil for controversy. Her stance resonated far beyond the studio, striking a chord with viewers who had felt similarly dismissed in their own lives. The cameras captured not just a clash, but a moment of self-assertion that challenged the unspoken rules of politeness that often silence truth. When the segment ended, the show moved on, but the impact lingered. Clips spread across social media, sparking debates about respect, tone, and the line between discussion and disrespect. Some viewers criticized the confrontation, others praised Patti's courage, but few remained indifferent. Like the scene in the maternity ward, it revealed how quickly power could shift when someone refused to accept mistreatment. Both stories, though unfolding in vastly different worlds, shared a powerful message. They showed that cruelty often thrives in moments of vulnerability, whether in a hospital bed or under studio lights. They also demonstrated that silence is not the only option, and that intervention, whether from an unexpected ally or from within oneself, can change the course of a moment. The daughter-in-law's ordeal ended with the restoration of her dignity, while Patti Labelle's stand reaffirmed her right to be heard on her own terms. In the end, these moments remind us that respect is not granted by status or age, but earned through empathy and fairness. They challenge us to consider how often we witness injustice and choose comfort over courage. And they offer a quiet but powerful hope, that even when faced with intimidation or dismissal, one voice, spoken at the right time, can leave oppression without words and open the door to something stronger than fear.